Number 8. Jennifer Levin. On August 26th of 1986, the lifeless body of 18-year-old Jennifer Levin was found in Central Park near 5th Avenue and 83rd Street. She was half naked and covered in bite marks, cuts and scratches. Her fingernails were bruised, suggesting she'd fought her killer. Levin's underwear was found 50 yards away from her body, and it was later determined that she'd been fatally strangled. She'd last been seen leaving a bar called Dorian's Red Hand in the company of 19-year-old Robert Chambers. The police went to his home and found him with deep, fresh scratches, which he claimed had been inflicted by his cat, before admitting that the pet had been declawed. He first denied leaving with Levin, but then upon being confronted with witness testimony, changed his story. Chambers then claimed that the young woman had left to buy cigarettes, but then recanted when told that Levin didn't smoke. His final version of events was that he'd killed her by accident, while trying to push her off because she'd assaulted him as they were having relations in the park. The case would be known as the Preppy murder due to the high status of both the victim and killer in the trial that followed. Chambers' legal team argued that he'd strangled Levin in self-defense during rough intercourse. His attorney would describe the young woman as promiscuous, claiming that she'd kept a diary of her relations and that her intimate history was admissible as evidence. After 9 days of deliberation in 1988, the jury deadlocked. Under a plea bargain, Chambers admitted manslaughter in the first degree. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison and released in 2003. Then, in 2008, he was given a 19-year sentence on unrelated drug trafficking charges. Number 7. Paulie Velez. Just before 7:20 a.m. on November the 11th of 2021, an unnamed female jogger was attacked as she ran on a footpath near Swan Lake and Woolman Rink. The assailant came up from behind, put her in a chokehold until she passed out, and forced himself on her. He then made off with her phone. The authorities distributed photos of the suspect that they'd obtained from surveillance cameras, and he was identified as 25-year-old Paulie Velez. A few days after the attack, the NYPD went to his mother's home in Howard Beach, Queens. The young man tried to escape by jumping fences, hiding under a deck, and then leaping into a body of water. Officers used thermal imaging cameras to track him and eventually took him into custody. He was arraigned in Manhattan Supreme Court on a multiple-count indictment that included robbery, abuse, and strangulation. Velez admitted to the attack on the jogger, claiming he'd grabbed her body a little bit and slipped a finger in her. At the time of his latest offense, he was on probation for an eerily similar 2020 attack in Sunny Isles Beach, Florida. He'd taken a woman from a Miami sidewalk and dragged her to a darkened alley, where he put her in a chokehold and threatened to remove her pants. The attack was interrupted by 2 witnesses, and Velez fled when the police arrived at the scene, but was ultimately arrested on charges of battery and kidnapping. He was released on probation with an ankle monitor and shared selfies of himself wearing it on social media. Velez eventually cut off his monitor and fled to New York City, where he lived in a Brooklyn homeless shelter before committing the assault on the jogger. Number 6. Christian Cooper. On May the 25th of 2020, Christian Cooper was birdwatching in an area of Central Park called The Ramble. Cooper, an African-American man in his late 50s, was involved in an argument with a woman named Amy Cooper, no relation. The dispute was sparked by the fact that the latter's dog was unleashed in violation of the Ramble's rules. Amy refused Christian's request to leash her dog, to which he responded by beckoning the pet in his direction with a treat. The woman began yelling at Christian to keep his distance, at which point he started recording her on his cell phone. He remained largely silent and calm as Amy pointed her fingers in his face, threatening to call the police. She was recorded saying, "I'm going to tell them there's an African-American man threatening my life." Amy was also seen dragging her Cocker Spaniel by its collar as it appeared to be straining and trying to get free. She followed up on her threats, and Christian recorded her as she spoke to a 911 dispatcher, asking for officers to be sent immediately. The video ended with him thanking her for finally leashing the dog, and both Coopers left the park by the time that the police arrived. The clip was shared on social media and viewed tens of millions of times, with the public being widely critical of Amy's actions of falsely presenting herself as being in immediate danger, taking advantage of a tendency for people and police to treat black people with suspicion. Amy, who came to be known as the Central Park Karen, later apologized for her actions and maintained that she wasn't a racist. She was fired from her job at Franklin Templeton and later lost a lawsuit of wrongful termination launched against the company. Her dog was briefly removed from her but later returned. The woman was charged with filing a false report, but the case was dropped after she completed a 5-session educational and therapeutic program focused on racial identity. Number 5. Maria Isabel Monteiro Alves. Brazilian woman Maria Isabel Monteiro Alves was training for the New York City Marathon and running through Central Park on September the 17th of 1995. At around 6 a.m., Alves was ambushed under the cover of darkness and rain. She was dragged down an embankment to a glen where she was abused and bludgeoned to death. The 44-year-old was subsequently buried in her native Brazil. Her murder sparked sensational headlines and a plethora of tips, but her killer was never caught. On August the 2nd of 2016, jogger Karina Vetrano, aged 30, was killed in eerily similar circumstances in Spring Creek Park, as she was also training for a marathon. Vetrano's killer was ultimately identified as Chanel Lewis. The incident's renewed interest in Alves' case resulted in detectives reopening files and interviewing witnesses once more. Several elements pointed to initial suspect Adolfo Martinez, at the time an itinerant can collector with a criminal past that included abuse as the perpetrator. He'd told a witness that a woman had been killed in the park hours before Alves was discovered. He'd been seen with blood on his hands and had earlier expressed an intention of stealing the jogger's Walkman. Martinez died of tuberculosis nearly 2 years after the killing. The case of Alves' death was closed in January of 2017 as homicide with exceptional clearance, meaning that the culprit was known but could no longer be prosecuted. Alves' 87-year-old mother, who was living in a suburb of Rio de Janeiro and had given up hope of the case being resolved, wept and repeatedly thanked detectives for learning the identity of her daughter's killer. Number 4. Taraka Larson. Brooklyn musician Taraka Larson was walking through Central Park at around 9 p.m. on July the 30th of 2013. In the path near the pond by 59th Street, the 26-year-old came upon 2 small and scrawny raccoons, which she later noted were moving strangely. Larson stopped and tried not to startle them, hoping they would ignore her, but the animals approached her and started sniffing her foot. One of them then jumped, sunk its claws in her leg and started gnawing at it. Larson kicked the raccoon off and ran away, subsequently seeking help at the Plaza Hotel. She explained her situation and staff suggested she immediately head to the hospital and get treatment for rabies. Staff at Roosevelt Hospital asked the musician if it was possible that she'd misidentified the animal that had attacked her, asking if it might have been a squirrel or small dog instead. Larson, however, provided them with an Instagram photo of the raccoons, which she'd taken right before the attack. What had started off as a really nice summer walk ended with her getting multiple shots to fight a potential rabies infection. Number 3. Heidi Jones. In late November of 2010, Heidi Jones, a meteorologist for WABC7 and Good Morning America, told the NYPD that she was being stalked by a Hispanic man, whom she also accused of assaulting her at an earlier date. The unidentified suspect reportedly approached her outside her home on November the 21st and threatened her. 37-year-old Jones claimed that the same man, whom she said was in his 30s or 40s, had tried to abuse her while she'd been out jogging in Central Park on the afternoon of September the 24th. He'd allegedly grabbed her from behind, dragged her into a wooded area and tried to force himself on her, but was ultimately scared off by 2 park visitors. Jones claimed that law enforcement had refused to take her initial report of the assault, which prompted a personal call and apology from the police commissioner. Detectives made lengthy investigations, scoured surveillance video, and appealed for witnesses. Upon interviewing Jones again on December the 13th, they noted inconsistencies in her story. Jones broke down and admitted to have fabricated the whole ordeal. She told detectives, "I did make this up. I made it up for attention," blaming stress from her work and personal life. In 2011, the forecaster, who'd since been terminated from her job, pleaded guilty to 2 misdemeanor counts of falsely reporting an incident. She was given 3 years probation, 250 hours of community service, and ordered to undergo mandatory psychiatric counseling. Today's topic was requested by Scott Gates and Clive Francis. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Trisha Meili and the Central Park 5. On April the 19th of 1989, Trisha Meili, a 28-year-old white woman, was brutally attacked while jogging through Central Park. She was found naked, gagged and bound while covered in blood and mud in a shallow ravine about 300 feet north of a path called the 102nd Street Crossing. She'd been abused and nearly beaten to death. Her skull was fractured so badly that her left eye was loosened from its socket. She'd lost close to 80% of her blood and was suffering from severe hypothermia. Meili was given last rites as her wounds were expected to be fatal, but after spending 12 days in a coma, she woke up unable to read, walk or talk. The woman eventually recovered, with some lingering disabilities related to loss of balance and vision, but had no memory of the attack. A group of over 30 youths had committed acts of violence in the park on the night, and 5 Black and Hispanic teenagers were eventually arrested for the attack on Meili. The group, who'd come to be known as the Central Park 5, consisted of Kevin Richardson, Raymond Santana, Antron McCrae, Yusuf Salam, and Corey Wise. The teens were interrogated without their parents for hours before 4 of them gave videotaped confession that they'd been involved in the attack on Meili. DNA evidence from the scene didn't match any of them, so prosecutors relied solely on their confessions. Crime was rampant in New York City in the late 1980s, and the Central Park jogger case drew national interest as a pivotal example of the city's lawlessness, youth crime, and violence towards women. The 5 withdrew their admissions of guilt within weeks, claiming they'd been coerced into confessing by the NYPD. After 2 trials, they were found guilty of offenses that included attempted murder, assault and robbery, which resulted in convictions of 6 to 13 years in prison. In 2002, the real criminal, Matthias Reyes, came forward and took responsibility for abusing and beating Meili when he was in his teens, claiming it was the right thing to do. He gave specific details about the crime, and his DNA was a match. He'd been found guilty of an assault 2 days before Meili, but was never a suspect in the Central Park jogger case, and wasn't prosecuted after his admission because the statute of limitations had passed. The 5 were cleared of all charges after nearly serving their full sentences. They subsequently filed a civil suit against New York City, receiving $41 million in a settlement, and their story inspired the award-winning drama miniseries When They See Us. Before we continue with our last listing, if you still want to watch a bit more They Will Kill You today, then stay tuned after to watch our prior release on When National Parks Go Wrong. Number 1. Michael McMorrow. 44-year-old real estate agent Michael McMorrow encountered teenage couple Daphne Abdella and Christopher Vasquez in Central Park on May the 22nd of 1997. They convinced him to join them at the lake, where they drank beer and malt liquor. Earlier in the evening, Abdella had reportedly told her friends, "I'm going to kill someone tonight," with Vasquez pledging his support. Abdella's parents had died when she was a child, and she was eventually adopted by a wealthy New York City couple. The teen was described as having a hair-trigger temper and was often hostile towards her adoptive family. She'd also developed a serious alcohol problem, for which she went to rehab. Abdella met Vasquez while rollerblading through Central Park, and they became inseparable. The former reportedly had a manipulative hold over Vasquez, an altar boy who didn't have friends and was clinging to her attention. In the most widespread version of events, at some point after reaching the lake with McMorrow, Abdella and Vasquez brandished knives and threatened him. The teens viciously stabbed and slashed McMorrow, with Abdella ordering her boyfriend to slice him from ear to ear. By the end of the attack, the man had been knifed over 30 times with his hands, nose, and neck almost severed off. Abdella then told Vasquez to disembowel the victim, after which they filled the body with rocks. She was quoted as saying, "He's a fatty, he'll sink." The teens were found by the police, washing McMorrow's blood off in the basement of the pricey apartment building where Abdella and her family lived. They claimed to have fallen while rollerblading, and the officers believed them. Abdella then called the NYPD and tried to give an anonymous tip that there was a body in Central Park Lake, but the call was traced to her home. Upon further interrogation, she immediately tried to pin the murder on Vasquez, claiming he'd killed McMorrow in a jealous outburst. The baby-faced butchers, as the media dubbed them in the aftermath, gave varied versions of events at their trial, with Vasquez maintaining that his girlfriend had dealt the fatal knife strikes. The jury struggled to determine which of them had been responsible, and they were both sentenced to 10 years in prison for manslaughter. They only served 6 years of their sentences and were paroled in 2004 with one condition specifically banning them from seeing each other.
Number 9. Stephanie Simpson. Known to house one of New Zealand's highest peaks, Mount Aspiring National Park sports beautiful mountainous landscapes, embedded with rugged terrain and challenging, often rapidly changing weather conditions. British hiker Stephanie Simpson disappeared in the park in February of 2020. The 32-year-old tourist was on a working holiday when she decided to go on a solo hike in the park over the weekend. She was never seen alive again, and her body was found washed up in a canyon a week later. Due to the massive land area, even thermal drones, dog teams and specialized search teams failed to find her at first. Eventually, after considerable effort, her boots and pack were discovered through aerial imaging. Although no one will ever know exactly what transpired, investigators believe Simpson left the hiking trail to check out a waterfall before being swept away. The clue to that was the fact that her boots were found over 2,950 feet upstream from her body, after she'd likely taken them off to go into the water. Number 8. Stephen Grunwald. It is believed that 24-year-old Stephen Grunwald was attempting to hike the Glacier Gorge Traverse on August the 29th of 2020 when he was last seen alive. Situated in the Rocky Mountain National Park in Colorado, the route, which is considered difficult, includes 11 peaks over 19 miles. Grunwald was reported missing by a friend on September the 10th, and his car was found at the route's trailhead, but recovery operations were continuously impeded by snow and heavy winds. 4 days after the search had begun, the rescue mission, which included a helicopter and a team of dogs, located his body between two peaks in an area called McHenry's Notch. A post-mortem examination revealed he died of multiple blunt force traumas. Number 7. Victoria McCloy and Jeffrey Bignell. In November of 2019, high school sweethearts Victoria McCloy and Jeffrey Bignell set out for a rock fishing trip on the Bald Head Peninsula in Torndirrup National Park, Australia, when they went missing. A newer hobby for Bignell, he was enthusiastic about the rock fishing experience, and he planned to go after a grouper that had eluded capture and broken his line during past visits to the area. After traveling from where they lived in Northam, on the morning of Friday, November the 22nd, McCloy contacted family later that evening to say they had safely arrived. But 3 days later, when they had still failed to return, a concerned family member traveled all the way to the park to find their abandoned car. Police suspected they had been swept off the south side of the rocks during a 13-foot swell over the weekend. They covered land and sea for the next 5 days, hoping to find them alive. Bignell's body was recovered on day 3, but rescue efforts were dropped without finding McCloy. Her family set up a GoFundMe page to conduct their own private search, but the body of the 22-year-old was never found. Number 6. Grand Canyon National Park, USA. Caitlyn Kenny, a student and resident of Colorado, vanished in January of 2012 while on a private rafting trip with friends through the Grand Canyon National Park. On the night of her disappearance, members of the group noticed she was acting out of character, but when they all retired to their tents, no one noticed that she hadn't. Upon waking up from a night of drinking, they realized she was gone. With temperatures reaching below zero throughout the night, the fear was she'd fallen into the water, and authorities were notified immediately. It was the beginning of a drawn-out search that offered few clues except for one set of footprints heading downstream that stopped a half-mile from the camp. 2 months later, a group of rafters spotted her body floating in the river, 30 miles from where the group had set up camp and where she was last seen. Her body was recovered and her identity confirmed. A coroner identified the cause of death to have been drowning and classified it as accidental. Number 5. Alexander Lofgren and Emily Henkel. It was 2 days after their expected return home from a backcountry camping trip in Death Valley National Park when the search for Tucson couple Alexander Lofgren and Emily Henkel began. Both experienced campers. They had set off into the park with jugs of water and at least 1 day's worth of food, which was more than enough for their expected short trip. But 4 days would pass until they were found and 5 until they could be rescued. The search had begun by checking all hotels in the area and issuing an alert for their car. Their cell phones were contacted and a backcountry log filled out by Lofgren was scoured, but neither avenue furthered their search. It was an aerial search over areas outside of Lofgren's listed destinations that finally provided a breakthrough for authorities. The car was found abandoned with 2 flat tires and a note inside detailing the direction they went. Instead of retracing the 22 miles they had just traveled, they had decided to trek toward Mormon Point, near another paved road. They'd made it within 2 miles of their destination when they were spotted on a steep ledge in a remote area of the park. Even though they'd been found an hour after their car was spotted, due to the difficult terrain and the angle of the ledge, all rescue attempts failed. It wasn't until the following afternoon that rescue teams were able to reach them and assess their situation. Henkel had sustained a severe injury to her foot and was flown directly to a hospital for surgery. Unfortunately, Lofgren had already passed away by the time the couple was found. Number 4. Austin Pfeiffer. A hunter became the hunted in September of 2020 when a man from Ohio was attacked and killed by a grizzly bear. Trekking into a remote part of Wrangell St. Elias National Park, 22-year-old Austin Pfeiffer and his hunting partner had planned for a 10-day trip. On the evening of the 19th, the pair found success and took down a large moose. They were half a mile from camp and it was getting late, thus the duo opted to leave the carcass for salvaging the following day. Hoping to make an efficient job of it, the next morning they decided to split the work, with Pfeiffer staying behind to prepare each load while his partner hauled them back to camp. It seemed to be an efficient plan, but it was also one that left both parties alone and vulnerable. While making his way back after only the first load, Pfeiffer's partner was attacked by a bear. He fortunately was able to reach for his gun and scare it off, but upon reaching the carcass, he discovered Pfeiffer's lifeless body. Pfeiffer's partner was safely evacuated, while his body was retrieved the following day. In such a remote location, rangers were never able to track down the bear, but no other visitors were known to be in the area. Number 3. Incident at Denali National Park and Preserve. Boasting the highest peak in North America, Denali National Park is a haven for lovers of extreme outdoor activities. Amongst them was a climbing duo who'd hoped to ascend Reality Ridge in May of 2020. Using its western face, the pair, identified only as a 32-year-old from Ohio and a 31-year-old from Utah, had set out at 5 a.m. but was soon caught in an icefall. Set just above them, a peak off the Ruth Glacier had become dislodged, and they were right in the way. Miraculously, the man from Utah was only knocked unconscious by the ice, but he awoke to find his partner hadn't been so lucky. By 6 a.m., the surviving man was able to contact park officials and somehow move away from the unstable debris. Another hour later, he was saved by a helicopter unit and mountaineering rangers who gave him medical attention and airlifted him to a hospital. Today's topic was requested by Chrissy Brewer and JJ Villanueva. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below. Number 2. Esther Nakajigo. In June of 2020, a young newlywed couple was at the wrong place at the wrong time as they drove through the exit of Arches National Park. Just as they approached, a gust of wind stirred up and sent the arm of a metal gate swinging straight into the road. Forcefully pushed out, the metal arm impaled their car, decapitating one of them. The victim was Esther Nakajigo, a human rights activist from Uganda who had moved to Colorado for a leadership program. Recognized by the United Nations for her work with women and awarded a full scholarship from the King of Buganda, she was only 25 at the time of her death. In response to her death, Nakajigo's family filed a $270 million wrongful death lawsuit against the national park. The suit claimed that park services had known for decades the dangers the gate posed, and that a simple padlock could have saved their loved one's life. The couple had been married for only 3 months. It was Nakajigo's first time at the park, which her husband had described as his favorite place in the US before the incident. Number 1. Joseph Orbeso and Rachel Nguyen. In July of 2017, a Californian couple, Joseph Orbeso and Rachel Nguyen, traveled to Joshua Tree National Park to celebrate Nguyen's birthday. The next time they were seen wasn't until 3 months later, when they were found locked in an embrace, both dead from gunshot wounds. Huddled under a tree they found for shade, with clothes draped across their legs, the couple appeared to have run out of water and had been rationing food. Investigators realized the implications. After likely getting lost in the park's 800,000 acres and battling 100-degree heat, Orbeso and Nguyen must have been pushed to desperation. Their wounds were determined to have been caused by the couple themselves. It's believed they saw it as the least painful way out of their plight. In the days following their disappearance, more than 250 searches were conducted, which included dog teams and helicopters. Temperatures rose so high at the time that 10 people were injured from extreme dehydration, and the search had to be scaled back. In the end, a trail of discarded water bottles and food wrappers led a group to their location.
Thanks for watching. Would you rather cross the entire length of Central Park blindfolded or spend a week in Skid Row? Let us know in the comments section below.